The kitchen table sat beneath a single lamp in a modest home in San Diego, California. The year was late 1941, and while most Americans slept soundly in their beds, one man remained awake, his brow furrowed in concentration. On the table before him lay scattered matchsticks, arranged and rearranged in patterns that only he could understand. This was not a game. This was not a hobby. This was Lieutenant Commander John Smith Thatch, and he was fighting a war that hadn't yet reached American shores, using weapons no more sophisticated than wooden splinters and imagination. The glow from that lamp would illuminate more than just matchsticks that night. It would light the path to one of the most significant tactical innovations in aerial warfare history. A solution so simple, yet so brilliant, that it would save countless American lives and fundamentally alter the course of air combat for generations to come. And it all began with a piece of intelligence that sent a chill down the spine of every American naval aviator in the Pacific. On September 22, 1941, the Fleet Air Tactical Unit Intelligence Bulletin published a report that would change everything. The document, stamped and circulated among Navy fighter squadrons, contained disturbing information about a Japanese fighter aircraft designated the Mitsubishi A-6M, but known to those who would come to fear it by a far simpler name, the Zero. The report detailed the Zero's extraordinary capabilities. It could climb faster than any American fighter. It could turn tighter circles. It possessed a rate of maneuverability that seemed to defy the laws of physics. American pilots flying their Grumman F-4F Wildcats would be facing an opponent that was superior in nearly every measurable way. The Wildcat was slower. The Wildcat turned wider. In a traditional dogfight, one-on-one, the mathematics were brutally simple and terrifyingly clear. The Zero would win. John Thatch read this report with the eyes of a man who understood what those words truly meant. Not statistics, not numbers on a page, but lives. The lives of young men, boys really, who would climb into their Wildcats and fly out over the vast Pacific Ocean to face an enemy who held every advantage. Thatch had spent his entire career in naval aviation. He had logged thousands of hours in the cockpit. He had studied aerial combat tactics until he could recite them in his sleep. And now, faced with this intelligence about the Zero, he knew with absolute certainty that everything they had learned, everything they had practiced, would not be enough. But Lieutenant Commander John Thatch was not a man who accepted defeat easily. Born in Pine Bluff, Arkansas in 1905, Thatch had grown up in an America that valued ingenuity and practical problem solving. His approach to challenges was straightforward, methodical, and rooted in the kind of common sense that came from a generation raised to fix what was broken with whatever tools were at hand. And so, rather than despair at the superiority of the Japanese Zero, Thatch decided to do what he had always done when faced with an impossible problem. He went to work. Every evening, after completing his duties as commander of Fighting Squadron 3 aboard the USS Saratoga, Thatch would return to his home in San Diego. While his fellow officers relaxed, while other men sought distraction from the growing tensions of a world at war, Thatch sat at his kitchen table, and there, beneath that solitary lamp, he began to experiment. The matchsticks became aircraft. The table became the sky. And in the quiet hours of those California nights, Thatch flew mission after mission, fought battle after battle, all in miniature. He would arrange the matchsticks in various formations, then move them according to different tactical scenarios. What if the Wildcats flew in pairs? What if they flew in threes? What if they approached from above, from below? What if they turned left? What if they turned right? Hour after hour, night after night, Thatch worked. His fingers moved the matchsticks across the table surface, recreating aerial maneuvers in 2 dimensions, trying to visualize how they would unfold in 3. The problem was maddeningly complex. The Zero could outturn the Wildcat. This meant that in any turning fight, the Japanese pilot would eventually get behind the American pilot, achieving the killing position that every fighter pilot sought, on the enemy's tail, guns pointed at his cockpit, with nowhere for the target to run. But Thatch's mind worked differently than most. He didn't think in terms of what the Wildcat couldn't do. Instead, he focused on what it could do. The Wildcat was rugged. It could take damage and keep flying. It had excellent armament with 650 caliber machine guns, and perhaps most importantly, American pilots were trained to work together, to fight as a team team rather than as individual warriors seeking personal glory. It was this last observation that led Thach to his breakthrough. If a single wildcat couldn't survive against a zero, what if two wildcats worked together in a way that made them impossible to defeat individually? What if they could protect each other, watch each other's backs, and turn the zero's superior maneuverability into a trap rather than an advantage? The solution came to him on one of those long nights. Thach was moving his matchsticks, simulating yet another scenario, when he saw it, the pattern, the geometry. It was elegant in its simplicity, brilliant in its execution, and potentially devastating in its application. He called it the beam defense position, though history would come to know it by a different name, the Thach weave. The concept was deceptively simple. Two wildcats would fly side by side, separated by a distance of about 200 yards. When one wildcat was attacked by a zero, both pilots would immediately turn toward each other as they crossed paths. The attacking zero would suddenly find itself not chasing one target, but facing the guns of the defending wildcat's partner. If the zero tried to follow the first wildcat through the turn, it would fly directly into the line of fire of the second wildcat. If it broke off the attack, the wildcats would separate and repeat the maneuver, ready to weave again at the first sign of danger. It was like a dance, a carefully choreographed ballet of death performed at 300 miles per hour. The beauty of it was that it didn't require the wildcat to outturn the zero. Instead, it used the zero's superior turning ability against itself. The Japanese pilot, accustomed to simply following his target through tighter and tighter turns until he achieved a firing solution, would now find that every turn brought him not closer to victory, but deeper into a trap. Thach stared at the matchsticks on his table, his heart pounding with the realization of what he had discovered. But a tactic that worked on a kitchen table with matchsticks was a long way from a tactic that would work in the sky with real aircraft and real bullets. Theory had to become practice, and for that, Thach needed to test his idea. The next morning, Thach approached one of his squadron's most skilled pilots, a young ensign named Edward Henry O'Hare. O'Hare, who would later become famous as Butch O'Hare and earn the Medal of Honor for his actions in combat, was known for his exceptional flying skills and his aggressive fighting spirit. Thach explained his idea, showed O'Hare the matchstick diagrams, and asked if he would be willing to help test the tactic. O'Hare agreed immediately. The test was simple in concept, though dangerous in execution. Thach would take 3 wildcats and fly as defenders, using his new weave tactic. O'Hare would lead 4 wildcats and attack as aggressors, trying to shoot down Thach's flight using conventional tactics. Both groups would use camera guns to record hits, turning the exercise into something that approximated real combat without the actual risk of death. They took off from North Island Naval Air Station on a clear morning. The sky stretched above them, infinite and blue, a perfect arena for their experiment. At altitude, the two groups separated, then turned toward each other. O'Hare, confident and skilled, led his 4 attackers in toward Thach's defenders. The aggressors held every advantage in numbers and, theoretically, in tactical position. This should have been a massacre, but as O'Hare made his first attack run, something strange happened. Every time he lined up on one of Thach's wildcats, every time he achieved what should have been a perfect firing solution, he suddenly found himself staring at the nose of another wildcat, its camera gun pointed directly at him. He broke off, tried a different approach, attacked from a different angle. The same thing happened, again and again and again. O'Hare was one of the finest pilots in the Navy. He could fly a wildcat through maneuvers that would make lesser pilots black out. He had studied every tactical manual, mastered every aerial combat technique, and yet, against Thach's weaving defenders, he couldn't score a single hit. More than that, in multiple instances, Thach's defenders achieved firing solutions on O'Hare's attackers. The weave wasn't just defensive, it was turning defense into offense, transforming what should have been helpless prey into dangerous predators. When both groups landed, O'Hare climbed out of his cockpit with a look of amazement on his face. He walked over to Thach, his eyes wide with the realization of what they had just proven. "Skipper," O'Hare said, his voice filled with excitement, "it really worked. I couldn't make any attack without seeing the nose of one of your airplanes pointed at me." Those words, spoken on a California airfield in early 1942, II represented more than just the validation of a tactic. They represented hope. Hope that American pilots might survive. Hope that the technological superiority of the Zero could be overcome. Hope that ingenuity and teamwork could defeat superior performance and individual skill. But Thach and O'Hare didn't know then just how soon that hope would be tested in actual combat. The world was about to change in ways that no one could have predicted. On December 7, 1941, just months after Thach had developed his weave tactic, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States was thrust into World War II. The conflict that Thach had been preparing for was no longer theoretical. It was real, immediate, and devastating. In the months that followed Pearl Harbor, American forces in the Pacific suffered defeat after defeat. The Japanese seemed unstoppable. Their Zero fighters dominated the skies. Their pilots, many of them veterans of the war in China, possessed combat experience that far exceeded that of most American aviators. The early battles were brutal lessons in the cost of unpreparedness. Thach's Fighting Squadron 3, redesignated as VF-3, was assigned to the USS Yorktown. As the squadron prepared for deployment, Thach drilled his pilots relentlessly on the weave tactic. He showed them the matchstick diagrams. He flew practice missions with them over and over until the maneuver became instinct. Some of the younger pilots didn't fully understand why Thach was so insistent on this particular tactic. They had never faced a Zero in combat. They couldn't know what Thach knew, couldn't feel the weight of responsibility that Thach carried, knowing that the tactic he had developed on his kitchen table might be the only thing standing between these young men and death. The test came in June of 1942 at a tiny speck of coral in the middle of the Pacific Ocean called Midway. The Battle of Midway would become one of the most important naval engagements in history, the turning point of the Pacific War. But for John Thach and his pilots, Midway was something else entirely. It was the moment when matchsticks became reality. On the morning of June 4th, Thach led a flight of 4 Wildcats off the deck of the Yorktown. Their mission was to escort torpedo bombers attacking the Japanese carrier fleet. The sky was clear, the ocean below them a vast expanse of blue. Somewhere ahead, hidden beyond the horizon, were the Japanese carriers, and protecting those carriers were squadrons of Zeros. The American torpedo bombers, obsolete and slow, were massacred. Zero after Zero dove through the formation, their 20-millimeter cannons tearing the vulnerable aircraft apart. Thach and his Wildcats tried to protect the bombers, but they were vastly outnumbered. And then, suddenly, Thach's worst fears materialized. A squadron of Zeros, their distinctive red circles visible on their wings, turned toward his flight. What happened next would be described in combat reports, analyzed in tactical manuals, and studied by military historians for decades to come. But for Thach and his pilots, living through it, time seemed to compress into a series of crystal-clear moments. Thach's wingman, Ensign Ram Dib, was the first to be attacked. A Zero, flown by an experienced Japanese pilot, latched onto Dib's tail. In a conventional dogfight, this would have been the end. The Zero would simply follow Dib through whatever maneuvers he attempted, getting closer and closer until the Japanese pilot achieved a firing solution. Dib would die, just another statistic in a war that was consuming thousands of lives every day. But Thach's squadron didn't fight conventionally. The moment the Zero committed to Dib, Thach saw it. He immediately turned hard toward his wingman, toward the attacking Zero. Dib, trained in the weave, saw Thach's movement and turned hard toward him. The 2 Wildcats, separated by several hundred yards, flew directly at each other. The Japanese pilot, focused on his target, suddenly found the geometry of the situation changing in ways he didn't understand. Dib's Wildcat was still in front of him, still apparently vulnerable. But another Wildcat was approaching rapidly from the side. The Zero pilot had to make a choice: continue his attack on Dib and risk being shot by Thach, or break off and lose his advantage. The Japanese pilot, confident in his aircraft's superior maneuverability, decided to stay committed to Dib. It was a fatal mistake. As the 2 Wildcats crossed paths, Thach rolled his aircraft and dove beneath his wingman. The Zero, following Dib, flew directly into Thach's line of fire. Thach pressed his trigger. 650 caliber machine guns roared to life. Tracers arced through the air. The Zero, caught completely by surprise, took hit after hit. Thach could see his rounds walking up the fuselage of the Japanese fighter, could see pieces of metal tearing away. He held the trigger down, pouring fire into the Zero until, finally, its engine ignited. The Zero, trailing black smoke and orange flames, fell away from the formation. The pilot never had a chance to bail out. One moment he had been the hunter, confident in his superior aircraft and his training. The next moment he was falling toward the ocean, his aircraft disintegrating around him. He had been beaten not by a better plane, but by a better tactic, by matchsticks arranged on a kitchen table thousands of miles away and months in the past. But the battle was far from over. More Zeros attacked. Again and again, Thach and his pilots executed the weave, turned toward each other, cross paths, separate, repeat. The maneuver required absolute trust. The pilots had to believe that their wingman would be there, would turn at the right moment, would protect them even as they protected their wingman. In the chaos of combat, with Zeros attacking from multiple angles, with tracer fire filling the air, with the ocean spinning below them as they maneuvered, that trust was everything. And the weave worked, not just once, but repeatedly. The Japanese pilots, many of them veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience, couldn't understand what was happening. They would get behind a Wildcat, only to find another Wildcat shooting at them. They would break off, try a different angle, and encounter the same problem. The American formation seemed impossible to penetrate. Word of the tactic spread quickly among the Japanese pilots flying that day. One of them, Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, would later describe his frustration. He had attacked what appeared to be a vulnerable Wildcat. Getting on his tail had been easy, exactly as he had done countless times before. But when he tried to close for the shot, another Wildcat appeared from nowhere, its guns pointed directly at him. Nakajima, one of the most skilled pilots in the Japanese Navy, was forced to break off and run for safety. He returned to his carrier furious, unable to comprehend how American pilots in inferior aircraft had defeated him. The Battle of Midway ended in a decisive American victory. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. The Japanese Navy, which had seemed invincible just months before, suffered a defeat from which it would never fully recover. The battle is remembered for many reasons. The bravery of the torpedo bomber crews who pressed home their attacks despite horrific losses, the skill of the dive bomber pilots who struck the Japanese carriers at the perfect moment, the intelligence work that allowed Admiral Nimitz to position his forces for an ambush. But for fighter pilots, for the men who would fly and fight in the skies over the Pacific for the next 3 years, Midway meant something else. It meant that John Thach's tactic, developed with matchsticks on a kitchen table, worked in actual combat. It meant that American pilots had a way to survive against the Zero. It meant hope. The Thach weave, as it quickly became known, was adopted across the Navy and the Army Air Forces. Pilots were trained in the maneuver before deploying to the Pacific. Squadron commanders drilled their men in the weave until it became second nature. The tactic saved countless lives, allowed American pilots to hold their own against superior Japanese aircraft until newer American fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair entered service. But perhaps more importantly, the weave represented something deeper, something fundamentally American. It was the triumph of ingenuity over raw capability. It was the victory of teamwork over individual prowess. It was the proof that sometimes the simplest solutions, developed with the most basic tools, could change the course of history. Marines flying Wildcats from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal adopted the Thach weave and used it to defend the island against daily Japanese attacks. The tactic confounded the Zero pilots flying from Rabaul. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most famous aces, would later write about encountering the weave. He described watching his fellow pilots, experienced and skilled, being unable to defeat it. The Americans had found a way to turn their disadvantage into an advantage, and there was nothing the Japanese could do about it except adapt their own tactics, which took precious time and cost precious lives. The weave wasn't perfect. Some American pilots criticized it, arguing that it was too defensive, that it gave up the initiative to the enemy. One of the most vocal critics was Lieutenant Swede Veitasa, himself an ace and a highly skilled pilot. Veitasa argued that against experienced, aggressive pilots, the weave could be broken. He even challenged Thach to test exercises where Victasa would play the attacker, claiming he could defeat the Weave. Whether Victasa was right or wrong became a matter of debate among fighter pilots. What was undeniable was that the Weave worked often enough and saved enough lives to become standard doctrine. And even when later fighters entered service, fighters that could match or exceed the Zero's performance, the basic principle of the Weave, pilots working in pairs to mutually support each other, remained fundamental to aerial combat tactics. The Japanese eventually developed counters to the Thatch Weave. During the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, Zero pilots led by Lieutenant Moriyasu Hidaka successfully broke through a Weave formation and shot down American aircraft. But by that time, the balance of power in the Pacific was shifting. American industrial might was producing fighters and pilots faster than Japan could match. The technological gap was closing, and in some cases, reversing. John Thatch continued to serve throughout the war. He became a test pilot, a task force operations officer, and later a carrier commander during the Korean War. After Korea, he contributed to the development of anti-submarine warfare tactics during the Cold War. He retired as an admiral, having served his country for 4 decades. But his legacy wasn't measured in rank or in the positions he held. It was measured in the lives saved by a tactic he developed with matchsticks on a kitchen table. It was measured in the pilots who came home from the war because they knew how to execute the Weave. It was measured in the generations of fighter pilots who studied his innovation and learned from it. The Thatch Weave remained relevant long after World War II ended. American pilots used it during the Vietnam War, adapting the basic concept to the era of jet aircraft and missile combat. The fundamental principle that 2 aircraft working together are more effective than 2 aircraft working separately proved timeless. Modern fighter tactics still emphasize mutual support, still train pilots to work in pairs, still build on the foundation that Thatch laid. In the decades after the war, Thatch was frequently asked about the development of the Weave. He would often show people the matchstick demonstration, moving the small wooden sticks across a table, just as he had done in 1941. To those who saw it, there was something almost magical about watching this simple farm boy trick, this elementary visualization tool that had changed aerial warfare forever, because that's what it was, fundamentally. A farm boy trick, the kind of practical, hands-on problem solving that came naturally to a generation raised to fix machinery with baling wire and ingenuity, to solve problems with whatever materials were at hand. Thatch didn't have access to computers or simulators. He didn't have advanced mathematical models or wind tunnel testing. He had matchstick and a kitchen table and a mind that refused to accept defeat. The story of the Thatch Weave is often told in military academies and flight schools, but its lessons extend far beyond the military. It's a reminder that innovation doesn't always come from laboratories or research facilities. Sometimes it comes from kitchen tables. Sometimes the most sophisticated solutions are built on the simplest foundations. It's a reminder that limitations can breed creativity. Thatch developed the Weave specifically because the Wildcat was inferior to the Zero. If American fighters had been superior, the Weave might never have been invented. Necessity, as the saying goes, is the mother of invention. It's a reminder that teamwork can overcome individual disadvantage. A single Wildcat couldn't beat a Zero, but 2 Wildcats working together using the Weave could not only survive but prevail. The tactic recognized that strength comes not just from individual capability, but from how individuals work together. And perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder that sometimes the most important innovations come from the most unlikely sources. A naval officer working alone in his home, using children's toys to model aerial combat, developed a tactic that would be used for decades and would influence fighter doctrine to this day. The lamp that illuminated Thatch's kitchen table that night in 1941 cast a light that reached far beyond San Diego. It illuminated the skies over Midway, over Guadalcanal, over the countless other battles where American pilots flew and fought and survived because of the Weave. It illuminated the path forward for naval aviation, showing that ingenuity and determination could overcome any obstacle. John Thatch passed away in 1981, 40 years after he first arranged those matchsticks on his kitchen table. He died knowing that his innovation had saved lives, had changed history, had proven that sometimes the simplest tools could solve the most complex problems. He died knowing that the farm boy trick he had developed had become part of the fabric of American military excellence. Today, when fighter pilots train, when they learn about aerial tactics, when they study the history of air combat, they still learn about the Thatch weave. They still practice the maneuver. They still understand that two pilots working together are more effective than two pilots working alone. The matchsticks are gone. The kitchen table has long since been replaced, but the idea, the innovation, the fundamental insight that John Thatch had that night remains. In a war defined by massive industrial production, by technological advancement, by the mobilization of entire nations, it's somehow fitting that one of the most important tactical innovations came from such a humble source. Not from a think tank or a research laboratory, but from a kitchen table. Not from advanced computer models, but from matchsticks. Not from a team of experts, but from one man, thinking, experimenting, refusing to accept that his pilots had to die simply because their aircraft were inferior. The story of the Thatch weave is more than just a military history lesson. It's a testament to human ingenuity. It's proof that the best solutions often come from the most unexpected places. It's a reminder that sometimes, when faced with an impossible problem, the answer isn't to give up or to wait for better equipment or more resources. Sometimes the answer is to sit down at a kitchen table, pull out some matchsticks, and start thinking, because that's what John Thatch did. And in doing so, he changed aerial warfare forever. He saved countless lives. He proved that American pilots flying inferior aircraft could defeat the best that the Japanese Navy could put in the air. He showed that teamwork, coordination, and tactical innovation could overcome any technological disadvantage, all with a farm boy trick, all with matchsticks on a kitchen table, all because one man refused to accept defeat and was willing to work night after night to find a solution. That's the real lesson of the Thatch weave. Not the specific tactics, though those remain important, but the mindset, the approach, the refusal to give up, the determination to solve problems with whatever tools are available. In the end, that lamp in Thatch's San Diego home, burning late into those California nights, was more than just a light to see matchsticks by. It was a beacon, a symbol of American ingenuity, of the power of simple solutions to complex problems, of the difference that one person, working alone, can make. And its light still shines in every fighter pilot who flies in formation, in every tactical manual that teaches mutual support, in every squadron that understands that together they are stronger than the sum of their parts. The farm boy trick that changed air combat forever wasn't really a trick at all. It was insight. It was innovation. It was the proof that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the newest aircraft or the biggest bomb. Sometimes it's just an idea, visualized with matchsticks, tested with determination, and proven in the crucible of combat over a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And that idea, born on a kitchen table in 1941, still flies with every fighter pilot who understands that they're never alone in the sky, that their wingman is there, that together they are stronger. That's the legacy of John Thatch. That's the legacy of the farm boy trick. That's the legacy of those matchsticks on a kitchen table that changed the world.